Nowadays, cardiovascular diseases are a major public health problem and as such demand our attention. Strokes have been the most common cause of death for women since 1980 and the second most common cause of death for men since 1989.
A stroke is a problem in the brain, a problem where one area of the brain suffers because of a disturbance in the blood supply. There are two main types of stroke. The first is ischemic, where there's a lack of blood flow because there's a blockage in a blood vessel. The part of the brain which is supplied by that blood vessel is starved of blood and suffers an infarction, tissue death. Just as you can have a heart attack, a cardiac infarction, you can have a cerebral infarction, tissue death in the brain. The second type of stroke occurs when a blood vessel breaks and there's bleeding, a hemorrhage. When there's bleeding in the brain, the cerebral structures are affected. Brain cells are compressed because there's no room for expansion inside the skull. The bones of the skull are fused together. The hemorrhage compresses the brain cells and the symptoms become apparent. And the brain is also affected because the broken blood vessel no longer supplies blood to the brain.
Strokes can affect anyone at any age. Even children can suffer from this kind of problem, but it's most common in people over the age of 70. The older a person is, the more likely they are to suffer a stroke. But not all old people have strokes. So which people are most at risk? There are several major factors. Does the person have high blood pressure? High cholesterol levels? Does he or she smoke? There are other factors. Does the patient have some form of heart disease? Are there genetic factors? But basically, the factors we always talk about are high blood pressure, high blood sugar levels, high cholesterol levels, and smoking.
The symptoms depend on which area of the brain is affected. Symptoms are quite distinctive according to where the stroke has occurred. There may be impaired mobility in one part of the body, and the patient might notice a lack of sensation in that area, numbness. The face can feel lopsided. Vision may be impaired on one side. Speech may be slurred. Less common symptoms are loss of balance, together with impaired vision, seeing double. Sometimes, even if we don't become much weaker, there may be loss of fine motor control, especially in the hands. Very occasionally, the patient may have a sudden splitting headache, and sometimes the patient may faint or lose consciousness. Once the patient has regained consciousness, we may see that their face has changed, become lopsided, or that when the patient starts to move again, there's one part of the body that the patient cannot move. When we come to study a stroke, we need to know what has caused it. So we examine the health of the arteries that connect the heart and the brain, passing through the neck. We can use ultrasound to examine the neck and the head, and if we find problems, we can carry out other procedures, using techniques like scanners or MRI to let us know what state the arteries are in. By inserting catheters into the arteries, we can diagnose problems and solve them at the same time. We can insert prostheses wherever we need to. But sometimes the problem is in the heart, and then we carry out tests on the heart.
Atrial fibrillation is the cardiac arrhythmia we see most frequently in our everyday consultations. This is the sinoatrial node, which generates normal sinus rhythm. It creates electrical impulses in the heart. These impulses start in the zone between the atria and the ventricles and make a regular circuit of electrical impulses around the heart, and that generates a normal heart rhythm. What happens with atrial fibrillation is quite different. When the sinal atrial node doesn't generate impulses properly, abnormal electrical circuits occur in the heart. There's a jumble of ducts and zones. The heart's rhythms become abnormal, and we see this kind of arrhythmia. This shows the normal impulse, and this shows how the impulses occur in atrial fibrillation. So, how do we diagnose atrial fibrillation? We use electrocardiograms. Here, we can see the P waves in a normal rhythm, with normal signals starting in the normal place. But with atrial fibrillation, we can see the difference. Chaotic signals leading to a disordered rhythm. Why do people develop atrial fibrillation? With age, because of high blood pressure, diabetes, following a heart attack, or because of defective heart valves, or because of other types of illness, for example, obesity or thyroid conditions. They can lead to chronic or temporary atrial fibrillation and cardiac insufficiency. People with heart disease, where the chambers of the heart are dilated, so that the electrical signals don't start in the right place. What are the symptoms of atrial fibrillation? Palpitation, shortness of breath, dizziness, chest pain. But sometimes the condition shows no symptoms and is first detected when the patient visits the doctor for another reason or at an annual checkup. What might cause an episode of atrial fibrillation in patients who've already been diagnosed? Alcohol, coffee, tea, lack of sleep, digestive problems, and physical exercise. So it's very important that people who've been diagnosed with atrial fibrillation are careful about how they exercise.
Before beginning any course of physical activity, it is a good idea to consult your doctor and have a checkup. Normally, the kinds of exercise that you'll be recommended are walking briskly, swimming or cycling. It's also been shown that gentler forms of exercise like yoga or tai chi are beneficial. Everyday activities like walking to work, going up the stairs, doing the housework are also excellent forms of exercise. Exercise is a very effective way of preventing strokes, and it's cheap.
In all treatments for atrial fibrillation, it's very important to find the balance between medication to stop the blood clotting and medication to stop bleeding. We often prescribe anticoagulants, but we have to take into consideration the dangers of bleeding for the patient, so we have to weigh up the risks and benefits. The population is aging. That's an objective reality, and we'll see more and more patients with atrial fibrillation. So both we and the medical authorities need to know what we're facing. Atrial fibrillation leads to a prothrombotic state. That's to say, thromboses and blood clots form more easily. Strokes are 4 to 5 times more likely to happen. We know that of those patients who've had a stroke because of atrial fibrillation, 25% will die within 1 month and 50% will die within a year. These are very high mortality rates. As we can see, atrial fibrillation is a heavy economic burden. If we can spot atrial fibrillation early on, we can reduce the risks. New types of oral anticoagulants are now appearing, and they're proving very successful.
Anticoagulants are one of the treatments neurologists use to prevent strokes. Strokes have different causes. So, what are the causes of stroke? You can look at stroke as one problem, but it's like a town square. There are various streets which end up in the same place, but the ways you get there can be very different. Patients who've had a stroke caused by a cardiac problem, and some patients who have problems because their blood coagulates too much, may benefit from treatment with anticoagulants as a preventative measure. Many people are treated with anticoagulants. The data we have shows that 1% of the population of Spain is receiving this kind of treatment. That's 500,000 or 600,000 people in Spain, about 25,000 in Aragon.
An oral anticoagulant is a synthetic product. made from plant extracts, and its basic effect is to slow down coagulation, clotting of the blood. And in that way, it prevents the development of thrombosis, where blood clot forms inside a blood vessel, and embolism, where a mass, an embolus, is carried by the circulation of the blood and may cause problems like strokes or other kinds of thromboses, where blood vessel becomes obstructed. That's basically the aim of an anticoagulant drug, to make sure the process of coagulation takes longer than usual. The risk of all treatment with anticoagulants is basically that of hemorrhaging, but we have guidelines for which range of patients are recommended for treatment with anticoagulant medicines. Criteria that must be met both for older types of treatments and for the new types of drugs which are becoming available. When we follow these guidelines, it's very rare that patients who meet these criteria show a tendency to hemorrhage.
Y los antiguos, como son las cumarinas, el sintrón, es muy raro que los pacientes que estén dentro del rango, dentro del intervalo recomendado, tengan tendencia hemorrágica.
Anticoagulant treatments must be strictly monitored if they're to succeed. It's a very effective form of treatment for the prevention of strokes, but there's an undeniable risk of hemorrhage. In most cases, the treatment has to be closely monitored because there are also many possible interferences, interactions between anticoagulants and other drugs or substances, which can put the patient at risk. So we have to find the right method for each patient to ensure their maximum safety.
At
the beginning of treatment, the first thing we often recommend is that patients don't change their diet, that they go on eating what they've been used to, so that we can adjust the dosages of the medications we prescribe accordingly.
We've had a system in place for about a year in Aragon, whereby patients move into a new stage of treatment, self-monitoring. The patient takes a blood sample from their finger, and the analysis of this blood sample allows the patient to adjust and modify their own treatment. This gives each patient improved quality of life without sacrificing the treatment's efficiency or safety.
Research has led to the development of new types of anticoagulants, which do not require this kind of checkup. There are two types. One directed at a blood protein called a thrombin, and the other directed at an enzyme called factor 10. But the net effect of both treatments is the same. International research has shown that these treatments are very effective, but only for one kind of pathology, related to strokes. In other pathologies, whether related to strokes or not, these treatments are not suitable. But research work is still being done.
At the moment, what we recommend to the general public in terms of stroke prevention is to lead a healthy life in general. Avoid toxins like tobacco and alcohol, and follow the advice your doctor gives you at your checkup, because there are systems which detect which patients are at risk of this kind of illness. We've seen that when people keep up with their checkups and follow their doctor's advice, there are fewer cases of stroke.
Primary care is taking action before strokes happen. Before a stroke occurs, there is a lot we can do. In Aragon, we have to bear in mind that 30% of the population smokes. Between 15 and 20% have high blood pressure, 5% are diabetic, and 15% have high cholesterol levels. And we, doctors working in health centres, know which these patients are. Acting on this information, just with this information, we can do a lot to help these people avoid having a stroke. We can improve our cardiovascular health, and we should, by keeping a check on cholesterol levels, diabetes, high blood pressure, smoking, stress, obesity, and heart rate.
The Mediterranean diet is a good example of a healthy diet because of its positive effects on health in general, and in particular for the prevention of cardiovascular problems, cancer and diabetes. Eat certain foods every day: cereals, bread, pasta, pulses, vegetables, potatoes, fruit and other seasonal produce. It's all natural. Cook what's freshest. Use olive oil as the main source of fat. Avoid salt and use herbs and spices to flavour your food instead. Eat yogurt and cheese every day. Eat a moderate amount of fatty fish, white meat and eggs each week. And nuts are very important. Red meat is for special occasions, once a month, and so are puddings, sweets and cakes, biscuits and pastries. Drink water and a glass of wine with your meal, why not? Variety, quantity and quality are all important. All these foodstuffs have something in common. They are all beneficial for cardiovascular health in general. They help to reduce levels of harmful cholesterol and to raise levels of the beneficial cholesterol, helping to keep us in good health. Patients taking anticoagulants can eat normally, but should avoid eating a lot, or always eating the same thing. A varied diet, like the Mediterranean diet, is a healthy, balanced diet. The only forbidden foods are those which are restricted for certain conditions: diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol levels. The only thing to be careful about are foods which contain a high level of vitamin K, and these should only be eaten occasionally, like dark green vegetables, cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, Savoy cabbage or chocolate, chestnuts, avocado, tea. Because these foods, if eaten in significant quantities, can interfere with anticoagulants.
If we suspect that somebody is having a stroke, if we see the symptoms that point to stroke, we have to remember that strokes are emergencies, medical emergencies like heart attacks. That's to say, we must act fast. Why should we act fast? Because there are measures we can take, but only within a limited time. Because once that time has passed, the measures are no longer effective and may even be dangerous. This means that we have to get the patient to hospital as soon as possible.
Fibrinolysis is a very important measure. It's a treatment to reopen a blocked artery. I'll explain more about the treatment in a moment. When someone has a stroke, the formation of a blood clot blocks the artery, blocking the supply of blood to the brain. That's what produces the stroke. Blood doesn't reach the brain. If a patient reaches a hospital in time, what do we mean by in time? Well, within 3 to 4.5 hours for those under 80, and up to 3.5 hours for people over 80. So if they get to a hospital within this short period after the first symptoms appear, then the medical team can see if this treatment, fibrinolysis, is viable, to remove the blockage from the artery. As the blood coagulates, a fibrin mesh is formed, and the drugs we use act on the fibrin mesh to dissolve it. The sooner we can administer the drug, the more tissue we can save.
After a stroke, patients begin their recovery period. Recovery is gradual, and the speed of recovery depends upon the location of the stroke, its size, and its type. So we can't predict how long the period of rehabilitation will be, or what degree of independence the patient will achieve. And for that reason, we don't like to talk about lasting effects of the stroke until after at least 90 days. Some patients are still improving a year after their stroke, and some see improvements all their life. They go on discovering new abilities. In most cases where we manage to halt the symptoms of the stroke, stop them from developing further, we see that the brain begins to recover. A phase of recuperation begins, where the brain will try to use its remaining abilities to adapt and adjust, to heal itself and recover. But we should remember that about 30% of stroke patients die. About 40% make a recovery, but suffer long-lasting effects. And the remainder make a full recovery with no after-effects to prevent them from having a normal life.
Y el resto que pueden recuperarse sin secuelas que les impidan llevar una vida normal.
Neurologists and politicians, and society in general too, I think, believe that stroke awareness is very important because it is the second most common cause of death in Spain, in Aragon. For women, it's the most common cause. And it's the second most common cause in men. It's the most common cause of disability in adults and the second most common cause of dementia. This makes it quite simply a very important issue. It's a social problem. We have to work to bring down stroke mortality rates and to reduce the major after effects of stroke. A stroke patient would tell you, stroke splits your life in two. And that really is the truth of the matter. The association ASENAR has made this documentary with the aim of making the general population of Aragon aware of the dangers of certain unhealthy conditions like high blood pressure, obesity, smoking, and lack of exercise. The information and recommendations in this documentary come from medical experts who are committed to working in the long term together with ASENAR.